At the will reading, my daughter cut me off. Keep your dirty money. She got $1. Then my counterattack hit. A twist that shocked her and a 30-day ultimatum.
My daughter looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would haunt me for months. Dad, I don't want your dirty money. Keep your inheritance. I'd rather have nothing than take a single penny from you. The lawyer sitting across from us shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Sarah pushed the will documents back across the mahogany table without even glancing at them. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been planning for this moment for 3 years, and the twist buried deep in that will was about to change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. You see, when your own daughter calls your life's work dirty money, when she looks at 47 years of building a business empire like it's something shameful, you start to question everything you thought you knew about family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story starts long before that devastating moment in the lawyer's office. My name is Robert Chen, and until recently, I thought I was living the American dream. Started with nothing but a toolbox and a beat-up pickup truck in 1976, built Chen Construction into one of the largest commercial contractors on the West Coast. We're talking about a company worth $68 million, employing over 400 people, with projects spanning from Seattle to San Diego. Not bad for a kid whose parents immigrated from Taiwan with less than $200 in their pockets. I had everything a man could want: the business, the respect, the financial security that comes from decades of smart decisions and relentless work. But most importantly, I had Sarah, my brilliant, beautiful daughter who graduated summa cum laude from Stanford Law, who could argue constitutional law over dinner and still laugh at my terrible dad jokes. She was my pride and joy, my legacy, my reason for building everything I had built. Or so I thought. The first crack appeared 3 years ago during what should have been a celebration. Sarah had just made partner at Morrison, Webb & Associates, one of San Francisco's most prestigious law firms. We were having dinner at her favorite restaurant, this little Italian place in North Beach, where the owner still remembered her favorite pasta from when she was 12 years old. "Sarah," I said, raising my glass of wine, "I've been thinking about succession planning for the company. You're 34 now, established in your career, and I'd love to start bringing you into the business side of things. Maybe you could join the board, learn how everything operates." The smile on her face vanished like someone had flipped a switch. "Dad," she said, her voice careful and measured in that way lawyers speak when they're trying not to say what they really think. "I appreciate the offer, but I have my own career. I'm not interested in the construction business." "Not interested?" I couldn't hide my confusion. "Sarah, this is your inheritance. This is what I've been building for you your entire life." She set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something cold and distant that made my chest tighten with worry. "That's the problem, Dad. You built it assuming I wanted it, without ever asking me what I actually wanted." The conversation that followed was like watching a relationship crumble in slow motion. Sarah told me things I'd never heard before, never even suspected. How she'd always felt pressure to be perfect, to live up to the success of Chen Construction. How her friends in law school had made comments about nepotism and family money, even though she'd earned her way into Stanford and her law firm on pure merit. How she'd spent years trying to prove herself professionally while carrying the weight of expectations she never asked for. But the worst part came at the end of dinner, when she looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, I love you, but I don't want to be associated with your business anymore. Some of the projects you've taken, some of the corners that got cut, the way workers were treated on those sites, it's not something I can support." I felt like she'd slapped me across the face. Corners cut? Workers mistreated? I'd built Chen Construction on a foundation of quality work and fair treatment. Sure, there had been disputes over the years, some unhappy subcontractors, a few safety violations that every construction company deals with, but nothing that warranted the disgust I heard in her voice. That night, I went home to my empty house in Pacific Heights and sat in my study surrounded by 47 years of awards, photos, and achievements, pictures of ribbon cuttings for hospitals I'd built, schools that housed thousands of children, office buildings that created jobs for entire communities. This was dirty money. This was something to be ashamed of. But as the weeks turned into months, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. The way certain business associates avoided eye contact during meetings. The stack of legal notices my attorneys handled that I'd always trusted them to manage without bothering me with details. I spent 6 months digging through my own company's records, and what I found made my blood run cold. My business partner, Marcus Webb, had been cutting deals I never approved, safety inspections that got rubber stamped without proper reviews, subcontractors pressured into working with substandard materials to meet impossible deadlines, workers who complained about unsafe conditions suddenly finding their contracts terminated. The worst discovery came when I found a folder buried deep in Marcus's office files. Bribes to city inspectors, payoffs to union officials, a whole network of corruption that had been operating under my nose for over a decade. My signature was forged on dozens of documents I'd never seen. My company, my reputation, my life's work had been systematically corrupted by someone I'd trusted like a brother. When I confronted Marcus, he laughed. Actually laughed. "Bob, you think you built this company on handshakes and hard work? Welcome to the real world. This is how business gets done in construction. You want to stay competitive, you play the game. I just made sure you could sleep at night with plausible deniability." Plausible deniability. Like I was some kind of mob boss who needed protection from my own criminal enterprise. The man I'd considered my closest friend had been systematically destroying everything I thought I'd built, and he acted like he was doing me a favor. That night, I called Sarah. We hadn't spoken in 2 months, not since our disastrous dinner conversation. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, her voice cautious and distant. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of arguing with Marcus and his team of lawyers. "You were right about the business, about the corners being cut, about workers being mistreated. I found evidence of things I never knew were happening, things that were done in my name without my knowledge." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Dad, I'm sorry you're going through this, but it doesn't change anything. Even if you didn't know, it happened under your watch. It happened because of choices you made about who to trust and how to run your business. But Sarah, I'm fixing it. I'm cleaning house, firing everyone involved, implementing new oversight procedures. I can make this right. I know you can, Dad, and I'm proud of you for doing it. But that doesn't mean I want to inherit a company that needs to be fixed. That doesn't mean I want my name associated with Chen Construction, even a reformed version of it." The line went dead, and I sat there in my study, wondering how everything I'd worked for had turned into something my own daughter couldn't bear to touch. But that conversation planted a seed of an idea, a plan that would take 3 years to fully develop and execute. You see, Sarah thought she knew what kind of man I was. She thought she understood what Chen Construction represented. But she was about to learn that her old man had a few surprises left in him, and that sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't money or property or even a business empire. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can leave your child is a lesson about justice, redemption, and what it really means to take responsibility for the consequences of your choices. Over the next 3 years, I quietly began implementing changes that would transform not just Chen Construction, but our entire industry in Northern California. I started documenting everything, building a case that would expose the corruption network Marcus had created. But more importantly, I started planning a will that would give Sarah exactly what she said she wanted, while teaching her something she desperately needed to learn about the complexity of moral choices and the weight of family legacy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Sarah wanted nothing to do with dirty money. Fine. She was about to discover what it actually meant to walk away from a fortune, and what happened to that money when someone with real principles decided to put it to better use. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The real story begins on the day I called Sarah's law firm and asked her to meet me at Richardson and Associates for the reading of my will. She assumed I was dying, of course. Why else would a healthy 71-year-old man suddenly want to discuss his last will and testament with his estranged daughter? Little did she know, this wasn't about my death at all. This was about rebirth, redemption, and the most expensive lesson in family values I'd ever given. When Sarah walked into that law office and saw me sitting there very much alive, her confusion was evident. But when she heard what was actually in that will, confusion turned to shock. Shock turned to anger, and anger turned to something I'd never seen in my daughter's eyes before: fear. For the first time in her adult life, my brilliant, confident daughter was afraid. Not of me, but of what she'd just learned about herself and the choices she was about to face. The lawyer, James Richardson, had been my attorney for 15 years. He'd handled everything from complex merger agreements to my divorce settlement, but I'd never seen him look as uncomfortable as he did that Tuesday afternoon in March. He kept adjusting his glasses and shuffling papers like he was handling radioactive material. Sarah had arrived 20 minutes early, probably expecting to find me on my deathbed surrounded by medical equipment and tearful goodbyes. Instead, she found me sitting in Richardson's conference room wearing my best suit, looking healthier than I'd looked in years, with a stack of legal documents that would change both our lives forever. The first thing she said when she walked through the door was, "Dad, what's wrong? Are you sick?" The concern in her voice reminded me of the little girl who used to bandage my scraped knuckles after weekend construction projects, who would stay up late helping me review blueprints, even though she was only 8 years old and couldn't understand a word of the technical specifications. "I'm not dying, Sarah," I said, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "But we need to talk about what happens to everything I've built when I do." Richardson cleared his throat and opened the legal folder with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to make it clear that your father's mental faculties have been thoroughly evaluated by 3 independent physicians. This will was prepared over a period of 18 months with extensive legal review and psychological assessment. Everything we're about to discuss represents Mr. Chen's final considered wishes." Sarah's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "Dad, why would you need psychological evaluation for a will? What aren't you telling me?" That's when Richardson began reading the document that I'd spent 3 years crafting, revising, and perfecting. The will that would either repair our relationship or destroy it completely, but would definitely teach my daughter the most important lesson of her privileged life. To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Chen, Richardson read in his formal courtroom voice, "I leave the sum of $1 to be paid immediately upon my death, along with this letter explaining my decision." The color drained from Sarah's face like someone had opened a valve. $1? She looked at me with an expression of hurt and betrayal that cut deeper than any business setback I'd ever experienced. "Dad, what is this? What did I do to deserve this?" Richardson held up his hand. "Please let me continue reading, Miss Chen. The will gets more complex from here." To the employees of Chen Construction, both current and former, who were adversely affected by safety violations, wage theft, or other illegal practices conducted without my knowledge, but under my ultimate responsibility, I leave the sum of $15 million to be distributed according to documented damages and suffering. Sarah's mouth fell open. $15 million? Dad, you're admitting to crimes in your own will. Do you understand the legal implications of what you're doing? I stayed silent, watching her brilliant legal mind start working through the ramifications. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about public admission of corporate wrongdoing, potential criminal liability, and the destruction of everything the Chen family name had represented in our community. Richardson continued reading, his voice growing stronger as he reached the heart of the document. To the San Francisco Legal Aid Society, I leave $10 million to establish the Sarah Chen Foundation for Corporate Accountability, dedicated to providing free legal services to workers who have been exploited by unethical business practices. Now Sarah was on her feet, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. "You named a foundation after me? A foundation designed to sue companies like yours? Dad, this is insane. You can't force me to be associated with this." "I'm not forcing you to do anything," I said quietly. "The foundation will operate whether you participate or not, but I thought you might want to have some say in how $15 million gets used to fight the kind of corporate corruption you've spent your career opposing." The next part of the will hit her like a physical blow. "To Marcus Webb and his associates who corrupted my company through bribery, fraud, and systematic exploitation of workers, I leave detailed documentation of their criminal activities, to be delivered simultaneously to the FBI, the IRS, the Department of Labor, and the California State Attorney General's office." Sarah sank back into her chair. "You're destroying your own business partner. Dad, Marcus can implicate you in everything. This documentation could send you to prison." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I replied. "Some things are more important than protecting yourself from the consequences of other people's crimes." Richardson was approaching the end of the document now, and I could see Sarah's hands trembling as she gripped the arms of her leather chair. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Finally, Richardson read, "To any organization or individual willing to continue the legitimate operations of Chen Construction under new management with complete transparency and ethical business practices, I leave the remaining assets of my estate, including the company itself, all construction equipment, real estate holdings, and intellectual property, valued at approximately $42 million. Sarah looked up at me with eyes that were beginning to fill with tears. What does that mean, Dad? Who's going to get the company? That depends entirely on you, I said, leaning forward across the conference table. You see, Sarah, 3 years ago you told me you didn't want my dirty money. You said you'd rather have nothing than inherit a company built on corruption and worker exploitation. Well, now you have exactly what you asked for. Nothing. But I also heard what you said about responsibility, about accountability, about making things right. So I've spent the last 3 years documenting every illegal practice, every safety violation, every bribe and payoff that happened in my name. I've fired everyone involved, implemented new oversight procedures, and created a path forward for Chen Construction that would make you proud to have your name associated with it. The Sarah Chen Foundation will have $42 million to work with, plus the ongoing profits from a reformed construction company that operates according to the highest ethical standards. You could run that foundation, Sarah. You could take everything I built through ignorance and corruption and transform it into something that actually helps people. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of what I'd done began to sink in. You're giving away everything, she whispered. 47 years of work, and you're just giving it all away. I'm giving it purpose, I corrected. Money without moral purpose is just numbers in a bank account. But money used to fight injustice, to help exploited workers, to build something better than what came before, that's not dirty money anymore. That's redemption money. Richardson closed the will and sat back in his chair, clearly relieved to have finished reading the most unusual estate document of his career. Miss Chen, he said, you have 30 days to decide whether you want to accept leadership of the foundation. If you decline, the foundation will be managed by a board of directors chosen by your father, and the construction company will be sold to the highest bidder who agrees to maintain the ethical standards outlined in the will. Sarah looked at me through her tears, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in her expression that I'd been afraid I'd lost forever. Respect. Dad, she said, her voice barely audible, I don't know what to say. This is the most insane, brilliant, terrifying thing anyone has ever done for me. It's not for you, I replied, though my own eyes were starting to water. It's for everyone who got hurt while I wasn't paying attention. It's for every worker who got cheated while I trusted the wrong people. And yes, it's for you too, because I want you to have something you can be proud of inheriting. But Sarah wasn't done processing the implications. She pulled out her phone and started typing notes, her legal training kicking in despite the emotional chaos of the moment. Dad, if you're admitting to criminal activity in this will, you need to understand that I can't represent you legally. There would be conflicts of interest, ethical violations on my part. You need your own attorney for what's coming next. I already have one, I said. Richardson's partner will be handling the criminal aspects of this case. Your job, if you choose to accept it, is to make sure the foundation actually helps people instead of just making lawyers rich. She looked up from her phone with the expression I remembered from her childhood, the same look she'd get when trying to solve a particularly difficult math problem or figure out how to build a treehouse that wouldn't fall down. The FBI investigation, she said slowly, working through the legal implications. How long have they been building their case? About 2 years, I admitted. I've been cooperating fully, providing documentation, wearing recording devices to meetings with Marcus and his associates. The indictments should come down within the next 6 months. Sarah's eyes widened. You've been working undercover for the FBI? Dad, do you understand how dangerous that is? These people have millions of dollars at stake. If they found out you were recording them, they didn't find out, I said simply, and now they won't have the chance to retaliate because everything's going to become public at the same time. The will, the criminal charges, the foundation announcement, the new ethical standards for the company, it's all coordinated to happen simultaneously, so no one can cover anything up or intimidate witnesses. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Who are you? She asked. This isn't the father I grew up with. That man would have protected his business at all costs. That man didn't know what his business was actually doing to people. I replied. Once I learned the truth, I had to make a choice. Protect my reputation and wealth, or protect the workers who were getting hurt in my name. It wasn't a difficult choice, Sarah. It was just an expensive one. Richardson gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder, but I could see Sarah's mind racing through possibilities I'd never considered. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the conference table like it held answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from shock to something more calculating. Dad, I need to understand something. If you've been planning this for 3 years, documenting everything, working with the FBI, that means you knew Marcus was corrupt long before our conversation at the restaurant. I felt my chest tighten. That wasn't entirely accurate, and Sarah's legal training had spotted the inconsistency immediately. I suspected something was wrong, I admitted. There were signs, things that didn't add up, but I didn't have proof until I started digging deeper after our dinner. So when I accused you of running a dirty company, you already knew I might be right. Her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since she was a teenager catching me in some minor parental deception. You let me think I was being unreasonable, that I was judging you unfairly. The weight of her accusation settled over me like a lead blanket. Sarah was right, and we both knew it. I'd let her carry the guilt of rejecting her father's life work when I'd already begun to suspect that work was built on foundations I couldn't defend. I was afraid, I said finally, afraid that if I told you about my suspicions, you'd walk away completely before I had a chance to fix anything. Afraid that admitting I'd been naive about Marcus would prove you were right to be ashamed of me. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but the hurt was still there. Dad, I was never ashamed of you. I was ashamed of what the company represented. There's a difference. Is there? I asked. Because for 47 years, I was Chen Construction. Everything I achieved, every decision I made, every worker I employed, it all happened because of choices I made or failed to make. How do you separate the man from the business when the business exists because of the man? She was quiet for another long moment, and I could see her wrestling with the same questions that had kept me awake for 3 years. Finally, she turned to Richardson. Mr. Richardson, I need to understand the legal structure of this foundation. If I accept leadership, what exactly am I accepting responsibility for? Richardson opened another folder and pulled out a thick document. The Sarah Chen Foundation for Corporate Accountability would be established as a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an initial endowment of $10 million, plus ongoing funding from the profits of Chen Construction under its new management structure. The foundation's mission would be to provide free legal services to workers who have been exploited by unethical business practices, with a focus on construction, manufacturing, and other industries where worker safety violations are common. And the board of directors? Sarah asked. That would be your decision as executive director, Richardson replied. Your father has suggested several candidates, including former employees of Chen Construction, who were terminated for reporting safety violations, representatives from workers' rights organizations, and legal professionals with expertise in labor law. Sarah looked at me with surprise. You want to put people you fired on the board of a foundation that bears my name? I want to put people who had the courage to speak up when I should have been listening, I corrected. People who lost their jobs because they tried to protect other workers. They deserve to have a voice in how this money gets used to prevent other companies from making the same mistakes I made. She picked up the foundation documents and began reading through them with the focused intensity I remembered from her law school days. After several minutes, she looked up with a frown. Dad, this foundation isn't just about providing legal services. According to this mission statement, it's also designed to investigate and expose corporate wrongdoing across multiple industries. You're essentially asking me to run an organization that will make enemies of every unethical business owner in California. That's exactly what I'm asking, I said. Because if you don't do it, who will? The workers who get hurt don't have the resources to fight back against companies that cut corners. The government agencies are understaffed and often corrupted by the same people they're supposed to be regulating. Someone needs to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Sarah set the documents down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You know what this reminds me of? She said. Remember when I was 12 and that kid Tommy Morrison was bullying the smaller kids at school? You told me that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do, and that people with advantages have a responsibility to protect people without them. I remembered that conversation. Sarah had come home upset because she'd gotten in trouble for confronting a bully, and I told her I was proud of her for standing up for others even when it cost her something. I never thought she'd remember that talk, let alone apply it to a situation like this. This is the same principle, isn't it? She continued. You have resources, connections, knowledge about how these systems work. Instead of using those advantages to protect yourself, you're using them to protect people who don't have those advantages. I nodded, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. That's exactly right. And you have advantages too, Sarah. Your legal training, your reputation, your understanding of how corporate law works. You could use those advantages to help people, or you could use them to make yourself richer representing the same companies that exploit workers. But there's something else, she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. If I take this position, I'll be giving up my partnership at Morrison, Webb and Associates. I'll be walking away from a seven-figure salary to run a nonprofit that fights against the very companies that could have been my clients. That's your choice to make, I said. I can't tell you what's more important to you, financial security or the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. But I can tell you that your partnership at that law firm comes with its own moral compromises. How many cases have you worked on defending companies against worker safety claims? How many times have you helped corporations avoid responsibility for environmental damage or wage theft? Sarah's face flushed, and I knew I'd hit close to home. Morrison, Webb and Associates was exactly the kind of firm that made its money helping companies like the old Chen Construction avoid accountability for their actions. That's not fair, Dad. Those cases were about following the law, ensuring companies get due process. I never did anything illegal or unethical. Neither did I replied. But legal and ethical aren't always the same thing, are they? Marcus never asked me to sign documents I knew were fraudulent. He just made sure I never looked too closely at what I was signing. Your law firm never asked you to lie to judges or fabricate evidence. They just made sure you never asked too many questions about whether your client's actions were actually hurting people. The silence that followed was heavy with implications we were both afraid to examine too closely. Richardson cleared his throat and checked his watch. "Miss Chen," he said, "you don't need to make a decision today. The will provides for a 30-day consideration period. But I should mention that your father has asked me to schedule a press conference for next Friday to announce the foundation's establishment and the criminal referrals against Marcus Webb and his associates." "A press conference?" Sarah's voice climbed an octave. "Dad, you're going public with this? Do you understand what that means for your reputation, for our family name?" "I understand exactly what it means," I said. "It means that everyone in San Francisco will know that Chen Construction was built on corruption and worker exploitation. It means that every business associate I've ever had will know I was either complicit in criminal activity or too naive to recognize it happening around me. It means that our family name will be associated with corporate scandal and FBI investigations." "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why destroy everything you've spent your life building?" "Because what I spent my life building was already destroyed," I said. The only question was whether I was going to let that destruction happen quietly, with workers getting hurt and criminals getting rich, or whether I was going to make sure something better grew from the wreckage. Sarah stood up and walked to the window overlooking Montgomery Street. Below us, the afternoon crowd of lawyers, bankers, and business professionals hurried between meetings, making deals, building careers, accumulating wealth. From this height, they looked like ants following predetermined paths, each focused on their individual goals without seeing the larger pattern they were part of. "You know what the worst part is?" she said without turning around. "I spent 3 years being angry at you for things I thought you'd done intentionally. I convinced myself that you were just another corrupt businessman who didn't care about the people you stepped on. It was easier to be angry than to admit I might have been wrong about who you are." "You weren't wrong about what happened," I said quietly. "People got hurt because of decisions made in my name. Workers lost wages they were owed. Safety violations put lives at risk. The fact that I didn't know about it doesn't make those people less hurt." "But you're making it right now," she said, finally turning back to face me. "You're giving up everything to make it right. That's not the action of a corrupt businessman, Dad. That's the action of someone who takes responsibility for mistakes even when they weren't entirely his fault." Richardson was gathering his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of our conversation. "Miss Chen," he said, "I'll need your decision by next Thursday if you want to participate in the press conference announcement. If you prefer to consider the position without public attention, the foundation can be established quietly and you can make your decision later." Sarah looked at me with eyes that reminded me of her mother, the same mixture of strength and vulnerability that had made me fall in love with Linda 35 years ago. "Mom would have been proud of what you're doing," she said. "She always said that real wealth wasn't about how much money you accumulated, but about how much good you did with whatever resources you had." "Your mother was wiser than both of us," I replied. "She would have spotted Marcus's corruption years before I did, and she would have found a way to fix it without destroying our family relationships in the process." "Maybe," Sarah said, "or maybe this is exactly how she would have handled it. She never backed down from a fight when she thought something was wrong, even when it cost her something important." We stood there looking at each other across the conference table, 47 years of shared history and 3 years of painful separation hanging between us like a bridge we weren't sure how to cross. The afternoon sun slanted through Richardson's windows, casting long shadows across the legal documents that would reshape both our lives. Dad, Sarah said finally, I have one more question about the will. If I accept the foundation position, what happens to you? Where do you go from here? That depends on several factors, I said. The FBI investigation might result in criminal charges, even though I was cooperating. The civil lawsuits from affected workers will probably drain whatever personal assets I have left after the estate distributions. And I'll need to find a way to rebuild my reputation and figure out what to do with whatever years I have remaining. So you could end up with nothing, she said. No money, no business, no reputation, possibly facing prison time. And you're willing to accept all of that to clean up a mess that other people made in your name. I'm willing to accept the consequences of my choices, I corrected. I chose to trust Marcus without proper oversight. I chose to focus on profits and growth without paying enough attention to how those profits were generated. I chose to remain ignorant about practices I should have been monitoring. Those were my choices, Sarah, and I'm responsible for the results. She nodded slowly, and I could see her making connections between the legal principles she'd studied and the human realities we were facing. This is about more than money, isn't it? She said. This is about what kind of legacy you want to leave, what kind of example you want to set for how people should handle their mistakes. Exactly, I said. I could have handled this quietly, negotiated settlements, made the problems disappear without admitting wrongdoing. That's what Marcus expected me to do, what my business attorneys advised me to do, but that would have taught you that wealth and connections can insulate you from the consequences of hurting other people. I didn't want that to be the lesson you learned from watching how I handled this crisis. Richardson was clearly eager to wrap up the meeting, but Sarah had one final question. Dad, if I take this position, if I run this foundation and help expose corporate wrongdoing across California, I'll be making enemies of some very powerful people. Are you prepared for what that might mean for both of us? I've been thinking about that for 3 years, I said. And I've concluded that making enemies of people who exploit workers is probably a sign that we're doing something right. The question isn't whether we'll face opposition, Sarah. The question is whether we'll face that opposition together or separately. She picked up the foundation documents and tucked them into her briefcase. I need time to think about this, to talk to some people, to understand exactly what I'd be committing to. But Dad, regardless of what I decide about the foundation, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you're doing. It takes courage to admit you were wrong and even more courage to sacrifice everything to make it right. As we prepared to leave Richardson's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since our disastrous dinner 3 years ago. Hope, not hope that Sarah would take the foundation position, though I desperately wanted her to. Hope that we might be able to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, instead of financial obligation. The next week would determine not just the future of Chen Construction and the Sarah Chen Foundation, but the future of our family. Whatever Sarah decided, I knew that the conversation we just had was the most important one we'd shared since she was a child, asking me why some people had more than others and what we were supposed to do about it. Now she was about to discover her own answer to that question, and I was finally going to find out what kind of woman I'd raised. The phone calls started the next morning. By 7 a.m., my assistant had fielded inquiries from 3 different reporters who'd somehow caught wind of the unusual will reading. News travels fast in San Francisco's legal community, especially when it involves FBI investigations and multi-million-dollar foundations. Sarah called at 8:15, her voice tight with stress. Dad, we have a problem. Someone leaked information about yesterday's meeting. The Chronicle is running a story tomorrow about Chen Construction and potential criminal charges. I wasn't surprised. Richardson's office employed dozens of paralegals and administrative staff, and a will that dramatic was bound to generate whispers. The question was how much information had gotten out and how quickly we could control the narrative. What exactly are they reporting? I asked, pouring my second cup of coffee while watching the fog roll across the bay from my kitchen window. The view from my Pacific Heights house had always calmed me during stressful times. But this morning, even the familiar sight of Alcatraz couldn't ease the knot forming in my stomach. They know about the FBI investigation, Sarah said. They know about Marcus Webb and the criminal referrals. They don't seem to know about the foundation yet, but that's probably just a matter of time. I sat down at my kitchen table and pulled out the notebook where I'd been tracking the various moving pieces of my plan. 3 years of careful orchestration, and now we were losing control of the timeline because someone couldn't keep their mouth shut. Sarah, I said, how quickly can you make a decision about the foundation? Because if we're going public anyway, we might as well do it on our own terms, instead of letting reporters piece together half the story. Dad, this is exactly what I was afraid of. Once this becomes public, every decision I make will be scrutinized. If I take the foundation position, people will say I'm trying to rehabilitate our family name. If I don't take it, they'll say I'm abandoning workers who need help. Welcome to the world of public accountability, I replied, though I said it gently. This is what happens when you try to do the right thing in a system that's designed to protect the wealthy and powerful. The question is whether you're going to let fear of criticism stop you from doing what you know is right. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, could picture her sitting in her downtown office surrounded by law books and case files, trying to calculate the personal cost of taking a moral stand. I need to see the workers' compensation files, she said finally. If I'm going to run a foundation that helps exploited workers, I need to understand exactly how our company hurt people. I need to see the faces behind the statistics. The files were stored in a secure facility in South San Francisco. 3 floors of documents detailing every workplace injury, safety violation, and worker complaint from the past 15 years. I'd spent weeks going through them myself, and each folder had felt like a punch to the gut. I'll have my attorney arrange access, I said. But Sarah, I need to warn you. Some of those files are going to be difficult to read. There are photographs of injuries that could have been prevented, medical bills from families who couldn't afford treatment, stories about workers who were afraid to report unsafe conditions because they needed their jobs. I know, Dad, but if I'm going to make this decision, I need to make it with complete information. I can't run a foundation to help workers if I don't understand what they've actually been through. That afternoon, I drove down to the storage facility to meet Sarah. She'd changed from her usual business attire into jeans and a sweater, as if dressing down would somehow make the experience less painful. We walked through rows of filing cabinets in silence, our footsteps echoing in the sterile warehouse space. The first file she opened contained photographs from a scaffolding collapse at a downtown hotel project. 3 workers had been hospitalized, one with permanent back injuries that ended his construction career. The safety inspector's report noted that the scaffolding had been assembled with substandard materials to save money, a decision made by Marcus's team without my knowledge. Sarah stared at the photographs for a long time, her face growing pale. This man, she said, pointing to a picture of a worker being loaded into an ambulance, what happened to him? Carlos Mendez, I said, reading from the file. 34 years old, 2 kids. The back injury required 3 surgeries. He couldn't return to construction work, ended up taking a job at minimum wage in a grocery store. His family lost their house. Did we compensate him? She asked. Marcus's team fought the claim for 2 years, I admitted. They hired doctors who said his injuries weren't work-related, lawyers who argued the accident was his fault for not following safety procedures. Carlos eventually settled for $30,000, barely enough to cover his medical bills. Sarah closed the file and reached for another one. This pattern repeated itself for 3 hours, file after file of workers who'd been injured, cheated, or endangered while building projects that made Chen construction millions of dollars. Some had received fair compensation, many had not. By the time we finished, Sarah was crying. Not the dramatic tears of our conversation at Richardson's office, but quiet tears of someone confronting the real human cost of corporate indifference. Dad, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, how did you not know this was happening? How did you build a company for 47 years without seeing what it was doing to people? The question I'd been asking myself every day for 3 years. The answer was complicated and uncomfortable, and probably insufficient to justify the harm that had been done. I knew about individual incidents, I said, but Marcus's team presented them as isolated problems, unavoidable accidents, workers trying to scam the system for money. They showed me statistics about industry averages, convinced me that our safety record was better than most construction companies. They made it seem like the workers who complained were just troublemakers or people looking for an easy payday. But you never investigated for yourself? Never talked directly to the workers who were filing complaints? I trusted my business partner to handle personnel issues, I said. Marcus had an MBA from Wharton, 20 years of experience in construction management, relationships with union leaders, and safety inspectors. I thought he was protecting the company's interests and the workers' interests at the same time. Sarah shook her head. Dad, you had 400 employees. These weren't just personnel issues, they were people's lives. How could you run a company that big without knowing what was really happening to the people who worked for you? The criticism stung because it was accurate. I'd been so focused on winning contracts, managing cash flow, and expanding into new markets that I'd lost sight of the human beings who actually did the work. I'd treated employees as line items on financial reports instead of people with families, dreams, and the right to go home safely at the end of each day. You're right, I said. I failed them. I failed you. I failed everyone who trusted me to run this company responsibly. That's why I'm trying to make it right now, even though it's probably too late for most of the people in these files. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the rows of filing cabinets that contained 15 years of documented suffering. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a resolve I hadn't heard since she was a child, determined to right some playground injustice. I'll take the foundation position, she said. Not because I forgive you for letting this happen, and not because I think running a nonprofit will somehow erase the harm that was done. I'll take it because these people deserve someone who will fight for them the way no one fought for them when they were working for our company. The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. Not because she'd accepted the position, though that meant everything to me, but because she was doing it for the right reasons. She wasn't trying to protect our family name or help me feel better about my mistakes. She was doing it because she'd looked at the evidence of real human suffering and decided she couldn't walk away. What's our next step? She asked, closing the final file cabinet. We go public, I said. Tomorrow morning, we hold a press conference announcing the foundation, the FBI cooperation, and the new ethical standards for Chen construction. We tell the whole story before someone else tells half of it. That evening, I sat in my study preparing the statement I would read to reporters the next day. The words needed to be precise, acknowledging responsibility without admitting to specific criminal acts, expressing regret without sounding like I was making excuses for what had happened. Sarah arrived at 8 p.m. with a draft of her own statement. She'd spent the afternoon consulting with legal ethics experts, making sure her transition from corporate law to nonprofit advocacy wouldn't violate any professional standards. Dad, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, I need you to understand something. Once we do this press conference, once we go public with everything, there's no going back. Your reputation will never recover from this. You'll be known as the businessman who admitted to running a corrupt company, regardless of whether you knew about the corruption or not. I understand, I said. But Sarah, my reputation was already destroyed. The only question was whether it would be destroyed by lies and cover-ups or by truth and accountability. I'd rather be known as someone who took responsibility for his mistakes than someone who tried to hide them. She nodded and pulled out her phone. I've been getting calls all day from partners at my law firm. They want to know if I'm really planning to leave Morrison, Webb, and Associates to run a nonprofit that will sue companies like their clients. The managing partner suggested I might want to reconsider, for the sake of my career. What did you tell them? I asked. I told them that sometimes career advancement and moral responsibility point in different directions. And when that happens, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in years. I also told them that I learned that lesson from my father. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the St. Francis Hotel, a location chosen for its symbolic significance. This was where Chen Construction had held its annual holiday parties for the past decade, where Marcus and I had celebrated our biggest contract wins, where we'd entertained clients and politicians who'd helped our business grow. Now it would be where we announced the end of that business and the beginning of something entirely different. Sarah and I arrived early to review our statements one final time. She'd chosen a simple black suit, professional but not flashy, the kind of outfit that suggested seriousness without drawing attention to itself. I wore the navy blue suit I'd worn to sign my first major construction contract 30 years ago, a reminder of the man I'd been before wealth and success had made me complacent. The hotel's conference room filled quickly with reporters, photographers, and cameramen. I recognized faces from the Chronicle, the Examiner, and several local television stations. In the back of the room, I spotted two men in suits who were almost certainly FBI agents, there to monitor what I said and make sure it aligned with my previous cooperation. At exactly 10 a.m., I stepped to the podium and looked out at the crowd of journalists who were about to hear the most expensive confession in San Francisco business history. Good morning, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. My name is Robert Chen. and I'm here today to take responsibility for serious failures in the management of Chen Construction, to announce my cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies investigating criminal activity within my company, and to establish a foundation dedicated to helping workers who have been harmed by unethical business practices. The room erupted in a flurry of camera flashes and scribbling pens. This was the kind of story that could make careers for ambitious reporters, and everyone wanted to capture every word. For the past 3 years, I continued. I have been working with the FBI to investigate systematic corruption within Chen Construction, including bribery of public officials, falsification of safety inspection reports, and theft of wages owed to workers. This investigation has revealed that my business partner, Marcus Webb, and several associates engaged in criminal activity without my knowledge, but under my ultimate authority as the company's owner. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Chen, are you saying you had no knowledge of these criminal activities? I'm saying that I failed in my responsibility to properly oversee the operations of my company, I replied. Whether or not I had specific knowledge of individual crimes is less important than the fact that those crimes happened, because I created an environment where they could occur without detection. The questions came rapidly after that. How much money was involved? How many workers were affected? What criminal charges were expected? I answered each question as completely as I could without compromising the ongoing FBI investigation. Then Sarah stepped to the podium, and the room's energy shifted. The reporters recognized her name from her work at Morrison, Webb, and Associates, and several seemed surprised to see her standing beside me instead of representing some corporate client. I'm here today, she said, to announce my resignation from Morrison, Webb, and Associates, and my acceptance of the position of Executive Director of the Sarah Chen Foundation for Corporate Accountability. This foundation, endowed with $10 million from my father's estate, will provide free legal services to workers who have been exploited by unethical business practices. A reporter from the Business Journal interrupted. Miss Chen, isn't this foundation just an attempt to rehabilitate your family's reputation after your father's admission of corporate wrongdoing? Sarah's response was swift and precise. This foundation exists because workers were harmed while my father's company generated profits. The foundation's mission isn't to rehabilitate anyone's reputation. It's to ensure that other workers don't suffer the same harm that Chen Construction's employees suffered. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, each one probing deeper into the details of our story. How much money would I personally lose? What happened to the corrupt business partner? Would I face criminal charges myself? Would the foundation really sue major corporations, or would it just handle small-scale employment disputes? By the time the press conference ended, I felt drained but oddly peaceful. For 3 years, I'd carried the weight of knowledge about Marcus's crimes and my own failures. Now that burden was shared with the public, and whatever happened next would happen in the open rather than in the shadows. Sarah and I walked out of the hotel together, past reporters shouting final questions and photographers snapping pictures of the father and daughter, who'd just turned their backs on wealth and status to pursue something more complicated and dangerous. Dad, she said as we reached my car, I have something to tell you. Last night, after I decided to take the foundation position, I called Mom's sister in Portland. I told her what we were doing, and she said something I think you need to hear. I waited, not sure I was ready for another emotional revelation. She said Mom would be proud of both of us. Not because we're trying to fix mistakes that never should have happened, but because we're finally acting like the people she always believed we could be. As we drove away from the St. Francis Hotel, I realized that Sarah was right. Maria would have been proud, not of the wealth I'd accumulated or the business empire I'd built, but of the decision to sacrifice everything for the chance to help people who couldn't help themselves. The foundation would face challenges I couldn't even imagine yet. Powerful corporations would try to discredit our work. Politicians would pressure us to moderate our positions. Other lawyers would question Sarah's decision to abandon a lucrative career for nonprofit advocacy. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like the man Maria had married. The man who'd started Chen Construction because he wanted to build something that mattered, not just something that made money. And Sarah was becoming the woman we'd both hoped she'd become, someone who used her advantages to protect people without them. The real work was just beginning, but we would face it together, and that made all the difference.